Nobody in that hospital knew who Rachel Monroe really was. To them, she was the quiet nurse who took extra shifts, the one who never complained, never talked about her past, never asked for credit. So when the CEO fired her for a mistake she didn't make, no one questioned it. They watched her walk through the lobby with a cardboard box, and not one person said a word. But when two Marines stormed through those front doors and asked for her by name, when they said a four-star general was dying and she was the only person he trusted to save him, every single person in that lobby realized they had made the worst mistake of their careers. Welcome to this channel. Before we dive into this wonderful story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It always amazes us to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it.
We are looking for our captain. Anyone seen her yet? Yes, we need her right now, else we are shutting down this entire building.
Rachel Monroe
Please,
hadn't
we need
seen
you to
the
come with
sun
us. The
in
general is
almost
dying.
2 days. 16 hours into a double shift, she moved through the third-floor recovery ward like a woman running on something deeper than caffeine. Her sneakers barely made a sound against the tile. Her scrubs were wrinkled. Her ponytail had given up hours ago, loose strands falling around a face that hadn't seen a mirror since yesterday morning. But her hands were steady. Her hands were always steady. She stopped at bed 7. Mrs. Calloway, 83 years old, hip replacement recovery, terrified of hospitals since her husband died in one 4 years ago. The old woman's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling like it might collapse on her. Rachel pulled a chair close and sat down. She didn't check the monitors first. She didn't glance at the chart. She looked at the woman. Can't sleep again? Mrs. Calloway shook her head slowly. Every time I close my eyes, I see Harold lying in that bed across the hall. Room 4B. That's where they put him. Did I ever tell you that? You did, Rachel said softly. Twice. I'm sorry, sweetheart. My mind keeps circling. Rachel reached over and adjusted the blanket across the woman's shoulders. Not because it needed adjusting, because the touch mattered more than the medicine. You don't have to apologize for missing someone, Mrs. Calloway. That's not a thing you apologize for. The old woman's chin trembled. She reached up and squeezed Rachel's wrist. You're the only one who sits down. Rachel smiled, small, tired, real. That's because I'm the only one stubborn enough to still be here. She stayed for another 5 minutes. Talked about nothing. Let the woman's grip soften until her eyes finally fluttered shut. Then Rachel stood, tucked the blanket one more time, and moved on to the next bed. That was Rachel. Every patient. Every time. She gave pieces of herself to strangers like she had an unlimited supply. Like the exhaustion pooling behind her eyes didn't matter, like the ache in her lower back was someone else's problem. She passed the nursing station and caught something on a chart that made her stop. She pulled it from the rack, scanned it twice, then flagged the page with a pen. A dosage notation was wrong, not dangerously wrong, but wrong enough. She corrected it, signed her initials, and put it back without a word. No one noticed. No one ever noticed. Chloe Danes noticed. Chloe came around the corner carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, so weak it was basically brown water. She held one out to Rachel. Drink this. Sit down. And then go home. Rachel took the cup, but didn't sit. I'm fine. You're not fine. You've been here 16 hours. Your eyes look like you lost a fight. Flattering. Ratch, I'm serious. You skipped lunch. You skipped dinner. I watched you eat a granola bar at 2 in the morning like it was a Thanksgiving meal. Go home. Sleep. Rachel sipped the coffee and grimaced. I'll sleep when I'm dead. That's not the flex you think it is. But Rachel was already walking. Already checking the next room. Already giving what she didn't have to people who would never know her name a week after discharge. Chloe watched her disappear down the corridor and shook her head. She'd known Rachel for 3 years, and she still couldn't crack whatever wall that woman had built around herself. Rachel would hold a dying patient's hand for an hour, but wouldn't let a friend drive her home. Something about her didn't add up. It never had. As Rachel passed the executive wing on her way to restock a supply cart, she noticed the light on in Derek Lawson's office. The door was slightly open. Inside, Lawson sat behind his mahogany desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his forearms, leaning forward like a man making plans he didn't want overheard. Across from him sat Greg Harmon, the hospital administrator, nodding slowly at something Lawson was saying. Papers were spread across the desk. Not patient files, financial documents, spreadsheets, things that didn't belong in a late-night meeting between a CEO and his enforcer. Lawson's voice was low, controlled. Rachel caught only fragments as she passed. Clean transition, no loose ends. Before Lawson glanced toward the hallway, their eyes almost met. Rachel kept walking. She didn't think much of it. CEOs had meetings. Administrators shuffled paper. That was their world, corner offices and conference calls. Her world was bed 7 and Mrs. Calloway's trembling chin. She didn't know that inside that office, her name was written on one of those papers. She didn't know that by tomorrow afternoon, everything she had built in this hospital would be gone. 700 miles away, in a military base briefing room that smelled like cold concrete and stale coffee, a man sat alone with a file he couldn't stop reading. Sergeant Ethan Cole turned a page he'd already turned 3 times. Rachel Monroe's personnel file, military service record, discharge papers, last known civilian employment. Her photograph was clipped to the corner. Younger in the picture. Sharper eyes. A face that hadn't yet learned how to hide. He stared at it like the photograph might say something the file couldn't. The door opened. Danny Voss walked in, boots heavy on the floor, a sandwich in one hand and zero patience in the other. He glanced at Ethan, then at the file, then back at Ethan. You've been staring at that thing for 20 minutes, man. Ethan closed the folder slowly. Haven't seen her in 6 years. Danny sat down across from him and took a bite of his sandwich. He chewed thoughtfully. 6 years is a long time to remember somebody. Ethan didn't respond. What happened between you two? Silence. Danny knew that silence. He'd served with Ethan long enough to know which questions got answers and which ones hit walls. This one hit a wall made of reinforced steel. He let it go. Then the phone on the desk rang. Ethan picked it up. His face changed as he listened. The easy stillness in his posture vanished. His jaw set. His hand gripped the receiver tighter. He hung up. General Carter is critical. Multiple organ failure. Internal bleeding they can't locate. Surgical team has failed twice. He paused. Before he went under sedation, he made one request. He asked for Rachel Monroe. Danny set down his sandwich. The nurse. Ethan stood. His chair scraped back hard against the floor. She wasn't always a nurse. So what's the play? I'll go. Ethan grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. Danny raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? They could send anyone. Ethan was already moving toward the door. He didn't turn around. Get the vehicle, Danny. And just like that, 2 lives that had been running in separate directions for 6 years were about to collide, in the last place either of them expected, and at the worst possible time. "3 hours. That's all it took to destroy everything Rachel Monroe had spent 3 years building. She had finally gone home. Finally kicked off her shoes, collapsed onto her couch, and let her body sink into the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones. She didn't even make it to the bedroom. She was asleep in 40 seconds flat, still in her scrubs, one arm hanging off the cushion, her phone face down on the carpet. She didn't hear it ring the first time, or the second. By the third call, she fumbled for it with numb fingers and pressed it to her ear. Rachel, you need to come in. It was someone from HR. A voice she barely recognized. Flat. Rehearsed. There's been an incident. Mr. Lawson has requested your presence immediately. She was back in the building within the hour, still pulling her hair into a ponytail as she pushed through the staff entrance. And the moment she stepped onto the 3rd floor, she knew something was very, very wrong. Alarms had already been silenced, but their ghosts still hung in the air. Nurses moved in tight clusters, whispering. A patient in recovery, stable just hours ago when Rachel had checked on him herself, had slipped into a sudden coma. Unresponsive. Vitals crashing. Emergency team called in. The cause, according to the preliminary log, was a medication error. And the medication had been administered under Rachel Monroe's credentials. Rachel's stomach dropped. She hadn't administered anything to that patient. She hadn't even been on that floor during the window in question. But there it was, her name, her badge number, her digital signature, logged into the system like a confession she never gave. And here's what should have made everyone suspicious. Derek Lawson, the CEO of a major hospital, a man who typically didn't set foot on a patient floor unless a camera crew was present, arrived on the 3rd floor within minutes. Not an hour later. Not after being briefed by department heads. Minutes. As if he already knew exactly what had happened and exactly where to be. He didn't ask the nursing staff what went wrong. He didn't consult the attending physician. He didn't request a review of the medication protocols. He gave orders. Rapid, specific, airtight orders that moved through the hospital like a machine that had already been assembled and was just waiting for someone to press the button. Security footage from the recovery wing? Unavailable. System malfunction, they said. The incident report? Already completed. Already signed. Timestamps that didn't line up with reality, filed before the investigation had even started, before anyone had asked Rachel a single question. By early afternoon, Rachel was called to the executive office. She walked in expecting a conversation. What she got was a sentencing. Lawson sat behind his mahogany desk like a judge who'd already made his ruling. His tie was perfect. His hands were folded. His face carried the expression of a man performing concern, the kind that never reaches the eyes. Greg Harmon stood by the door with his arms crossed, positioned like a bouncer at a club nobody wanted to be in. Lawson didn't offer her a seat. He read from a prepared statement, word for word, like he'd practiced it. A patient under your direct care has entered a critical coma due to a medication error logged under your credentials. This hospital has a zero-tolerance policy for clinical negligence. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. Rachel's face drained of color. Her lips parted. I wasn't even on that floor when the medication was. Your badge has been deactivated, Lawson continued, as if she hadn't spoken. HR will process the paperwork. Security will escort you from the building. Greg Harmon stepped forward and placed a cardboard box on the edge of the desk. It was already assembled. Already waiting. Like they'd built it before she walked in. Rachel stared at that box. Her hands began to tremble, a deep, involuntary shake that started in her fingers and crawled up her wrists. She pressed them flat against her thighs. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would not fall apart in this room with these two men watching her crumble. She picked up the box. She walked out. The lobby felt like a tunnel, long and narrow and suffocating. Every step echoed. Staff she had worked beside for years suddenly couldn't find her eyes. They looked at their clipboards. They checked their phones. They turned toward walls like the paint had become fascinating. Whispers followed her like smoke, low, shapeless, everywhere. Chloe saw her from across the hall and moved fast, pushing past a supply cart, calling her name. Ratch, wait. But Greg Harmon intercepted her, one hand raised like a traffic cop. It's been handled, he said coldly. Step back. Rachel heard Chloe's voice break behind her. She heard her name called again. And again. She didn't turn around. Because if she turned around, she would break. And Rachel Monroe had learned a long time ago, in a place far more brutal than this hospital, that you don't break until you're somewhere safe. And nowhere felt safe right now. She was 10 steps from the exit. 10 steps from disappearing. Then the hospital doors exploded open. Not gently. Not politely. They burst inward with the kind of force that makes every head in a room snap toward the sound. 2 Marines in full operational uniform strode into the lobby like the building had been expecting them and didn't know it yet. Their boots hit the tile in unison. Their faces carried the expression of men who had not come to ask permission. Every conversation stopped. Every whisper died. The air in the lobby shifted, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in a heartbeat. The taller Marine. Broad-shouldered, jaw tight, eyes scanning the room like he was clearing a building, locked onto the front desk. Behind him, Danny Voss stepped forward with controlled precision. Where is Nurse Rachel Monroe? Linda Marsh blinked from behind the reception counter. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She doesn't work here anymore. The taller Marine's eyes swept the lobby, past the frozen staff, past the security guard who suddenly looked very small, past Lawson, who had stepped out of the executive wing with his arms folded and his chin lifted. And then his gaze landed on her. Rachel, standing near the exit, cardboard box in her arms, hair falling loose around her face, eyes red but dry. The lobby disappeared. 6 years of silence, 6 years of distance and unanswered questions, and a war that neither of them had ever talked about, collapsed into a single, breathless second. Ethan Cole looked at Rachel Monroe, and something behind his eyes cracked wide open. There you are. Nobody moved. The entire lobby stood frozen, nurses mid-step, visitors mid-sentence, the security guard mid-breath. Two Marines in operational uniforms had just walked into a civilian hospital like they owned the ground beneath it, and every person in that room understood instinctively that whatever was about to happen was above their pay grade. Derek Lawson did not share that instinct. He stepped out of the executive wing with the practiced stride of a man who had spent his entire career walking into rooms and expecting them to rearrange themselves around his authority. He straightened his tie. He buttoned his jacket. He assembled his face into the expression he reserved for board meetings and reporters. Controlled, superior, untouchable. This hospital does not permit unauthorized military personnel to enter and disrupt. Danny Voss didn't let him finish. Without a word, Danny reached into his jacket, pulled out a leather credential case, and placed it flat on the reception desk. The sound it made, leather against marble, was the loudest thing in the room. This request comes directly from military command. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice that filled a room by weight, not volume. The voice of a man who had delivered orders in places where getting the words wrong meant people didn't come home. Lawson looked at the credentials, then at Danny, then at Ethan. His mouth opened, but nothing came out right away. You could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the CEO brain trying to assess the situation, trying to find the angle, trying to determine who in this room had more power than he did. The answer was standing in combat boots. Ethan Cole stepped forward. He didn't look at Lawson. His focus was entirely on Rachel. Still standing near the exit, still holding that cardboard box like it was the last solid thing in her world. But when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire lobby. Clear, measured, deliberate. A 4-star general is dying at the military hospital. Multiple trauma surgeons have attempted intervention and failed. Internal bleeding they can't locate. Collapsing vitals. Organ systems shutting down one by one. He paused. Let the gravity settle. Before General Carter went under sedation, he made one request. Ethan turned slightly and pointed directly at Rachel. Her. The lobby rippled. Heads turned toward Rachel. Eyes that had avoided her 5 minutes ago now stared with open confusion. The woman they had just watched get escorted out with a cardboard box, the disgraced nurse, the negligent employee, the liability, was being requested by a 4-star general of the United States military. Lawson let out a laugh. It came out thin and shaky, the kind of laugh people produce when reality stops making sense and their ego refuses to adjust. He looked around the lobby for someone to laugh with him. No one did. She's just a nurse, he said. And the way he said it, dismissive, Al. The military vehicle pulled away from the hospital curb and merged into traffic, and for a full minute, nobody said a word. Rachel sat behind the passenger seat, her back pressed against the leather, her eyes fixed on the city sliding past the window. Buildings blurred. Streetlights smeared into long golden streaks. The world outside was moving, but inside the vehicle, time had thickened into something heavy and still, like the air before a storm that hasn't decided whether to break. Ethan sat across from her. He didn't stare directly. He watched her reflection in the glass, the ghost of her face floating over the passing city. And he noticed something that made his chest tighten. Her posture had changed. Back in the hospital lobby, she'd been standing like a woman carrying weight she couldn't put down, shoulders curled, arms wrapped around that cardboard box like it was the only thing holding her together. But the moment she dropped that box and said, "Let's go," something shifted. Now she sat with her spine straight, her hands flat on her knees, her chin level. Military posture. Clean. Automatic. The kind of positioning that doesn't come from thinking. It comes from years of training that never fully leaves your body, no matter how long you've been gone. It came back the moment she made the decision. Ethan almost smiled. He caught himself just in time. Danny Voss drove with both hands on the wheel and one eye on the rearview mirror. He could feel the tension in the vehicle like a third passenger, sitting between Rachel and Ethan, taking up all the breathable air. Danny was not a man who did well with silence. Silence made him twitchy. "So," he said, glancing in the mirror. "Busy day?" Rachel didn't laugh. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Ethan caught Danny's eye in the mirror and shook his head slowly. One small movement. Message received. Danny pressed his lips together and returned his full attention to the road. The city hummed past. Military radio chatter crackled low from the dashboard, coded phrases and clipped voices that meant nothing to most people, but everything to two of the three people in this vehicle. Rachel's eyes moved slightly, tracking the cadence, listening, translating, without even meaning to. Then she spoke, still facing the window, still watching the reflection of a life she'd walked away from. How bad is he? Ethan didn't sugarcoat it. She would have known if he tried. They've lost him twice on the table. Blood pressure won't hold. The surgical team has attempted intervention 3 times and failed. Internal bleeding they can't locate. It's coming from somewhere, but every time they think they've found it, it shifts. His vitals are collapsing in stages. They're running out of time. Rachel absorbed this in silence. Her fingers began to tap against her knee. A rhythm. Quick, precise, almost mechanical. Index finger, middle finger, ring finger, repeat. Ethan recognized it instantly. She used to do that before every field operation. Back in the unit, the other medics would fidget or pace or crack their knuckles. Rachel would tap. It meant her mind was already working, already sorting through variables, scenarios, solutions. She was back in medic mode and didn't even realize it. She turned from the window and faced him. Her eyes had changed. Sharper now, focused, the exhaustion still there, but pushed behind something stronger. Why did you volunteer for this? Ethan shrugged. Someone had to. There are hundreds of Marines on that base, Ethan. Any one of them could have driven here and delivered the message. She held his gaze without flinching. Why you? The vehicle hummed. The radio crackled and went quiet. Danny kept his eyes welded to the road like his life depended on not being part of this conversation. Ethan was silent for a long time. Long enough that the city outside changed. Commercial buildings giving way to military fencing, concrete walls, checkpoint lights in the distance. Because I wasn't going to let someone else come find you. The words filled the space between them and stayed there. Neither of them addressed what they meant. Neither of them needed to. Some things are louder when you don't explain them. Rachel turned back to the window, but something in her posture softened. Barely, almost invisibly, like a wall that had held for 6 years developing its first hairline crack. Ethan briefed her the rest of the way. The general's surgical history, his age, prior conditions, the 3 failed interventions, and what each team had tried. Rachel's voice changed completely. The softness disappeared. She asked questions, precise, rapid, clinical. What was his pressure at the time of the second attempt? Did they image the retroperitoneal space? What anticoagulants is he on? Ethan answered each one. Danny glanced in the mirror again, and the woman sitting in the back seat wasn't the same person who had climbed into this vehicle 15 minutes ago. She was someone else entirely. Someone built for exactly this moment. The vehicle stopped at the military hospital entrance. Rachel stepped out and stood still, staring up at the building. Gray concrete. Military flags. Armed personnel at the gate. She hadn't set foot inside a military facility in 6 years. The smell hit her first, diesel and disinfectant, and something metallic underneath. It smelled like a life she'd amputated. Ethan came around the vehicle and stood beside her. Not in front of her. Not behind her. Beside her. You don't have to do this alone. Rachel took a slow breath. The kind that fills your lungs completely and steadies everything that's shaking underneath. I always have. She walked toward the entrance without waiting for him. Her stride was even. Her hands were still. Her shoulders were set like a woman walking into a firefight she'd already decided to win. Ethan watched her go. Danny stepped up next to him. She always like that. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, she is. The trauma wing of the military hospital was a war zone without bullets. Monitors screamed in overlapping pitches. Nurses moved between stations with the tight, rapid steps of people who knew they were losing. 3 surgeons huddled over CT scans pinned to a light board, arguing in clipped, heated voices, pointing at images, shaking heads, talking over each other like men drowning in a problem none of them could solve. And at the center of it all, behind a wall of glass and machines, General James Carter lay on a table with his life leaking out of him 1 heartbeat at a time. Blood pressure dropping, heart rhythm destabilizing, oxygen saturation falling like a countdown nobody wanted to finish. Rachel walked through the double doors of the trauma wing with Ethan and Danny behind her. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. The moment she stepped onto that floor in civilian clothes with no badge, no credentials, and no business being there. Every head turned. Dr. Nolan Pierce saw her first. The lead trauma surgeon, tall, sharp-featured, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, moved to block her path like a wall in a white coat. Who authorized this? His voice was clipped. Angry. The kind of angry that comes from hours of failure and no one to blame. She's not credentialed. She's not on staff. She's not setting foot in my operating room. Ethan stepped forward, his jaw set, ready to speak. But the door behind them opened first. Sergeant Kyle Bennett walked in. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He carried himself with the quiet, immovable authority of a man who had spent his career standing beside power and delivering its orders without flinching. He looked at Dr. Pierce, then at Rachel, then back at Pierce. General Carter's last conscious directive was specific. His voice was level. Final. Let her work. Dr. Pierce stared at Bennett. He looked at Rachel again, this unknown woman in wrinkled civilian clothes who had somehow become the dying wish of a four-star general. Everything in his training told him this was wrong. Everything in his chain of command told him to step aside. He stepped aside. Rachel moved to the scrub station. She turned on the water, and the sound of it, steady, clinical, familiar, cut through the noise like a blade. She lathered her hands, worked the soap between her fingers, under her nails, across her wrists. Methodical, practiced, every motion precise. The room watched her. Surgeons, nurses, Ethan, all of them watched her hands move through the preparation like she'd done it 1,000 times. She had, but not in a place like this. Kabusa, 6 years ago, a desert road in a country most people back home couldn't find on a map. A convoy of Marines on a routine patrol. The kind of mission that gets one line in a report and no mention on the news. For vehicles, 16 personnel, clear skies, no intelligence suggesting contact. Then the first explosion turned the lead vehicle into fire and scrap metal. Gunfire erupted from elevated positions on both sides of the road. Coordinated, precise, the kind of ambush that's been planned for days by people who know exactly what they're doing. Communications were destroyed in the first 30 seconds. The radio operator took shrapnel before he could send a distress signal. 12 Marines were hit in the first 90 seconds. 12 men, some thrown from vehicles, some pinned under wreckage, some still trying to return fire with blood pouring from wounds they couldn't see. No air support, no backup, no extraction for 9 hours. And in the middle of all of it, the dust, the gunfire, the screaming, one person moved. Rachel Monroe, younger then, leaner. Her face streaked with dust and blood that wasn't hers. She carried a medical bag that was never designed for this, a standard field kit meant for minor injuries, not mass casualties. It ran out within the first hour. She triaged under fire. She didn't wait for the shooting to stop because it wasn't going to stop. She crawled between bodies and wreckage, dragging men behind cover with one arm while applying tourniquets with the other. Her hands shook. They never stopped shaking. But they never made a wrong move. When the gauze ran out, she tore strips from her own uniform. When the tourniquets ran out, she used belts, bootlaces, torn fabric, anything that could hold pressure on a wound long enough to keep a heart beating. She rotated between 12 men for 9 hours, checking pulses, adjusting pressure, talking, always talking, to the ones who were slipping. You're not dying today. You hear me? Not today. Ethan Cole was one of them. Shrapnel had torn into his right side, deep, ugly, bleeding fast. Rachel found him slumped against the rear tire of an overturned vehicle, his face gray, his eyes losing focus. She dropped beside him and pressed both hands into the wound, so hard her arms trembled. Stay with me, Cole. Her voice was raw but steady, commanding. You hear me? Stay with me. His eyes found hers, barely, like a drowning man finding the surface. His hand reached up and gripped her wrist. Not with strength, but with everything he had left. I'm not going anywhere. She stayed with him for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of pressure and blood and talking about nothing, about everything, about a diner back home that made terrible pancakes, about a dog he had as a kid, about anything that would keep his eyes open and his mind anchored to the living world. When his bleeding finally slowed, she squeezed his hand once, then moved to the next man, and the next, and the next. For 9 hours. Alone. When extraction finally came, Helicopters tearing through the sky like prayers answered too late. All 12 Marines were alive. Every single one. The rescue team moved through the wreckage counting bodies, expecting the worst, and found 12 men breathing. Some barely. Some held together with bootlaces and torn fabric and the sheer willpower of a woman who refused to let any of them go. Rachel collapsed the moment the last man was loaded onto the helicopter. Her knees hit the dirt. Her hands, still shaking, still covered in blood, fell to her sides. She didn't speak for 2 days. Back in the present, Rachel finished scrubbing in. She pulled on sterile gloves with a snap that cut through the tension like a gunshot. She approached General Carter's bed and stood over him. This man who had once commanded thousands, now reduced to failing monitors and desperate measures. The surgeons watched her. Dr. Pierce watched her. Ethan stood behind the glass, his hands pressed against it, watching the woman who had once held his life together with her bare hands. Rachel didn't look at the monitors first. She looked at the patient. She studied the surgical site, the incisions, the clamps, the interventions that 3 teams had attempted. She reviewed the notes. She traced the timeline of his decline with her eyes. Slow, methodical, the same way she had once scanned a battlefield. Then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer. She looked at something near the lower left quadrant, an old surgical site from a previous operation. Something small. Something every surgeon in the room had scanned past because it didn't match what the textbooks told them to look for. A tiny compression, barely visible, pressing against a vessel that fed circulation to half his abdomen. Not a bleed, not a rupture. Pressure. Slow, silent, invisible pressure that was strangling the general circulation like a hand tightening around a garden hose. Every surgeon in that room had been chasing blood. Textbook response. Find the bleed, stop the bleed, stabilize the patient. That's what the training says. That's what the protocols demand. But Rachel Monroe didn't learn medicine from textbooks. She learned it in the dirt, with 12 dying men and no supplies and 9 hours of hell. She learned to look for what everyone else ignores. And she found it. Rachel didn't ask permission. She gave orders. Reposition the clamp, 2 centimeters lateral. Release pressure on the left side. Slowly. Prep for a controlled decompression. Her voice filled the operating room like it had always belonged there. Calm. Clear. Absolute. Not loud. She didn't need volume. She spoke with the kind of authority that doesn't come from rank or title. It comes from having made life-and-death decisions in places where hesitation meant a body bag. Dr. Pierce hesitated. His hands hovered over the surgical field. Every instinct in his training was screaming at him. This woman wasn't credentialed, wasn't on staff, wasn't supposed to be here. He looked at Rachel. She looked back at him. Not with anger. Not with arrogance. With certainty. The unshakable certainty of a woman who had done this before. Not in a sterile operating room with teams and technology, but in the dirt, with nothing, while bullets tore the air apart around her. Pierce nodded. He followed. The room moved with her. Surgeons who had objected to her presence 5 minutes ago now responded to her instructions without question. Something had shifted, the way a room shifts when the right person finally takes control and everyone else exhales because they no longer have to pretend they know what to do. Rachel worked with steady hands. She guided the decompression millimeter by millimeter, relieving the pressure that had been slowly choking the general circulation while 3 surgical teams chased a bleed that was never the real problem. It was delicate, painstaking. One wrong move and the compression could rupture instead of release, and they'd lose him for good. The monitors fluctuated. Numbers jumped. A nurse called out, "Pressure's dropping again." The room tensed. Rachel didn't flinch. "Hold," she said. "Give it a moment." Everyone held their breath. The monitors beeped, irregular, searching, uncertain. Rachel's hands stayed motionless. Her eyes stayed fixed. She was reading the patient the way she used to read a battlefield, not by the noise, but by the silence between the noise. 3 seconds passed. 5. 7. Then, a heartbeat. Steady. Strong. Rhythmic. The blood pressure climbed. Slowly at first, then with confidence. The oxygen levels followed. The monitors, which had been screaming for hours, began to sing a different song. Stable. Alive. Holding. The room exhaled. Not one person, the entire room. Like a collective breath that had been trapped for hours finally finding its way out. Dr. Pierce stared at the screen, then at Rachel. His face carried the expression of a man watching something he couldn't explain and might never fully understand. "How did you see that?" he asked quietly. Every surgeon in this hospital looked at those scans. 3 teams. "How did you see what none of us could?" Rachel peeled off her gloves, dropped them in the bin. Her face betrayed nothing. Combat medicine teaches you to look for what everyone ignores. She turned and walked out of the operating room, through the double doors, into the hallway. It was empty. White walls. Fluorescent lights humming that low, constant hum that sounds like loneliness if you listen long enough. Her footsteps echoed against the tile. She made it about 20 steps. Then her legs gave out. Not dramatically. Not with a sound. She simply stopped walking, and her body decided it was done holding her up. She slid down the wall, slowly, like a building settling, and sat on the cold floor with her knees pulled to her chest and her back pressed against the plaster. And her hands, the hands that had just saved a 4-star general's life, the hands that had held 12 soldiers together in the dirt of Kabusa, the hands that hadn't trembled once in that operating room, began to shake. Violently. Uncontrollably. Like 6 years of suppressed earthquakes finally reaching the surface all at once. The adrenaline was gone. The armor was gone. Everything she had held together, the firing, the humiliation, the lobby, the ride, Kabusa, the surgery, crashed into her in one devastating wave. Not one thing. All of it. All at once. She pressed her shaking hands against her knees and stared at the wall across from her and breathed. That's when Ethan found her. He came around the corner and stopped. He saw her on the floor, knees up, hands trembling, eyes fixed on nothing. And he did the only thing that mattered. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer words. He didn't try to fix it or explain it or make it smaller than it was. He sat down beside her, right there on that cold hospital floor, his back against the same wall, his shoulder close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth without the contact. Close enough that if she needed to lean, she could, but far enough that the choice was hers. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. It held 9 hours in the desert. It held 6 years of distance. It held the sound of a heartbeat that had almost stopped and didn't. It held everything they'd been carrying, separately, silently, since the last time they'd been this close. Minutes passed. Maybe 5. Maybe more. Time doesn't work the same way when you're sitting on a hospital floor next to someone who once watched you hold the world together with your bare hands. Then Rachel whispered. She didn't look at him. She spoke to the air in front of her, like she was confessing to no one and everyone. I spent 6 years trying to forget that I was good at this. Ethan stared straight ahead. His voice was low, steady, careful. You spent 6 years pretending you weren't extraordinary. The words landed on her like a blanket she didn't know she needed. She turned to him. Her eyes were red but dry. She wasn't crying. Rachel Monroe didn't cry. But whatever lived behind her eyes was closer to the surface than it had been in years. "Why didn't you ever reach out?" she asked. Ethan was quiet for a long time. The hallway hummed. Somewhere down the corridor a door opened and closed. His jaw worked, like he was chewing on the honest answer, and it tasted like something he'd been swallowing for 6 years. "Because you left without saying goodbye." He paused. "I figured that was your answer." The truth hung between them, raw, undecorated, impossible to argue with. Rachel let it sit. She owed him that. She owed him more than that. "I ran because I couldn't separate it," she finally said. Her voice was barely above a breath. "The trauma and the people. Every face I saved was also a face I saw bleeding. Every voice I heard calling for help in the dark was a voice I'd hear again at 3 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. If I stayed near any of you, near the unit, near the base, near any of it, I would never stop hearing the explosions." Ethan nodded slowly. Not because he agreed. Because he understood. "I heard them every night anyway," he said. "The explosions. The gunfire. All of it. Every night for 6 years. He turned his head slightly toward her. "The difference is, I also heard your voice. Telling me to stay. Telling me I wasn't going anywhere." His voice dropped to something barely above silence. And that was the part one didn't want to lose. Rachel looked at him. Really looked at him. Not the quick glance in the lobby. Not the guarded assessment in the vehicle. She looked at Ethan cold the way you look at someone when you finally stop running long enough to see who's been standing behind you the entire time. And something cracked open inside her that she knew. with absolute certainty, she would never be able to close again. Now, if you believe that people like Rachel deserve to be seen and protected, not bullied, not silenced, not pushed out by people who don't deserve to stand in the same room as them, hit that subscribe button. We don't stand for bullies on this channel. For 2 days, Rachel Monroe and Ethan Cole existed in the space between something and nothing. They didn't name it. They didn't define it. They moved through the military hospital like two planets caught in each other's orbit, close enough to feel the pull, far enough to pretend they didn't. They ate meals in the same cafeteria, sitting across from each other with trays of food neither fully tasted, talking about small things. The general's recovery. The weather. A terrible cup of coffee that Danny swore was the worst thing the military had ever produced, and that included MREs. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. Sometimes they just sat in the same room and let the quiet hold them. The kind of quiet that only exists between two people who have seen each other at their worst and decided to stay anyway. Rachel monitored General Carter's recovery with the same precision she brought to everything. Checked his vitals every 4 hours. Reviewed his charts. Adjusted small things the surgical team overlooked, not because they were incompetent, but because Rachel saw details the way some people see color, in shades and layers no one else noticed. Ethan watched her work. He watched her move through the halls with that quiet authority that wasn't performed. It just lived in her. And every time she glanced his way, every time her guard dropped for half a second and something warm flickered behind her eyes, he felt the ground shift under his feet. It was fragile, unspoken, beautiful in the way that only breakable things are. And then it broke. Rachel was walking toward the east corridor when she heard Ethan's voice. He was around the corner, phone pressed to his ear, pacing slowly. She almost called out to him. Almost. Then she heard what he was saying. I need a full audit of the executive records at Riverside General. Yes, medication logs, security footage archives, procurement documents. Everything tied to the CEO's office. A pause. The footage from that wing was deliberately erased. The incident report was time-stamped before the investigation even started. Someone orchestrated this from the inside. Rachel stopped walking. Her name is Rachel Monroe. She was terminated under false pretenses. I'm requesting military intelligence involvement on the grounds that a decorated combat veteran was targeted. Rachel's blood went cold. She waited, perfectly still, listening to Ethan lay out her life. Her firing, her humiliation, her pain, to a stranger on the phone like it was a case file. Like it was a mission. Like she was a problem he had decided to solve without ever asking her if she wanted it solved. He hung up, turned, and found her standing 3 feet away. The look on her face told him everything. Rachel, I can explain. What are you doing? Her voice was quiet. The dangerous kind of quiet. The kind that comes right before something detonates. Ethan straightened. I'm trying to help you. Lawson framed you. The evidence is right there. The missing footage, the pre-written reports, the medication logs. Someone set you up, and I'm not going to stand here and watch you lose everything because a corrupt CO needed a scapegoat. You went behind my back. Rachel's words landed like stones. One by one, heavy and deliberate. You accessed my records. You contacted military intelligence. You made decisions about my life, about my career, my name, my story. Without asking me. Because I knew you wouldn't ask for help yourself. That wasn't your choice to make. The hallway felt smaller. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder. Ethan stepped toward her. Rachel didn't step back, but something in her posture hardened, walls rebuilding in real time. Rachel, Lawson destroyed your career. He framed you for something you didn't do. You're telling me you don't want justice. I didn't ask you for justice. Her voice dropped, sharp, cold, precise. Like a scalpel. I didn't ask you for anything, Ethan. Not 6 years ago. Not now. This is what everyone does. Everyone decides what Rachel needs without ever asking Rachel. She stepped closer. Her eyes burned. The hospital decided I was guilty without an investigation. Lawson decided I was disposable. HR decided I didn't deserve a hearing. And now you show up with a uniform and a rescue mission and you think that gives you the right to run my life. To go behind my back and make calls about my future like I'm some broken thing you found on the side of the road. That's not what I'm doing. Then what are you doing? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly the same. Someone else deciding they know what's best for me. Someone else taking control because they think I can't handle it. I think you can handle anything. Ethan's voice cracked. Just barely. Just enough. I've watched you handle things that would destroy most people. I'm not doing this because I think you're weak, Rachel. I'm doing this because what happened to you was wrong and somebody needs to. Somebody. Rachel's laugh was hollow. Bitter. Were you? Because this isn't about justice, Ethan. This is about guilt. 6 years of guilt. You feel like you owe me because of Kabusa, so you show up and you play hero and you tell yourself it's about doing the right thing. But it's not. It's about making yourself feel better for never picking up the phone. The words hit like shrapnel. Ethan's face changed. The openness, the warmth, the careful tenderness he'd been carrying for 2 days. All of it vanished behind something hard and wounded. Maybe if you hadn't disappeared for 6 years, he said slowly, his voice low and rough, I wouldn't have had to track you down like this. The corridor went silent. Rachel went very still. The kind of still that only happens when something inside a person snaps clean in half. I didn't disappear. Her voice was barely a whisper now, but every word carried the weight of 6 years. I survived, and I did it without you. She turned and walked away. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, steady, even, controlled. The walk of a woman who had spent her entire life leaving before anyone could see her fall apart. Ethan didn't follow. He stood in that empty hallway with his phone still warm in his hand and watched her disappear around the corner. The same way she disappeared 6 years ago. No goodbye, no backward glance. Just gone. Danny found him a few minutes later, leaning against the wall. Head back, eyes closed, hands hanging at his sides like a man who'd just let something precious slip through his fingers. You okay? Ethan shook his head slowly. I finally had her back. His voice broke on the last word. And I just lost her again. The chapel was empty. Rachel pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the dim, quiet space like a woman looking for somewhere to hide from her own thoughts. The room was small. A few rows of wooden pews. Soft light filtering through stained glass that cast pale blue and gold across the floor. No people. No noise. Just stillness. She sat in the last pew, the farthest from the front, the closest to the door, because even in a chapel, Rachel Monroe positioned herself near the exit. She stared at nothing. At the wall, at the cross, at the dust floating in the light. Her mind spiraled. She thought about the hospital, 3 years of double shifts, of holding dying patients' hands, of catching errors and covering gaps and never once being thanked. And the moment someone needed a scapegoat, they didn't even hesitate. They handed her a box and erased her like she'd never existed. She thought about the military. 6 years of service, of saving lives under fire, of giving everything she had to people who would never know her name. And when she left, no one came after her. No one asked why. They let her walk away like she was replaceable. And now Ethan, the one person she had started to believe might actually see her. Not the medic, not the nurse, not the woman who fixes things. Just her. And he'd gone behind her back. Made decisions. Taken control. Just like everyone else. Was it love? Or was it guilt? Was he here because he wanted her? Or because she'd saved his life and he couldn't live with the debt? She didn't know. And not knowing was the worst part. Because for 2 days on that hospital floor, and in that cafeteria, and in those quiet moments where their shoulders almost touched, she had started to hope. And hope, for Rachel Monroe, was the most dangerous thing in the world. Because every time she let herself hope, someone handed her a cardboard box. She pressed her palms together, fingers interlocked, knuckles white, not praying, just holding herself together. 3 days after the surgery, General James Carter opened his eyes. It wasn't dramatic. No gasping breath. No sudden jolt. Just a slow, heavy lifting of eyelids, like a man surfacing from deep water, 1 inch at a time. The light hit him first, then the sounds, the steady beeping of monitors, the low hum of machines keeping him tethered to the living world. Sergeant Kyle Bennett sat in a chair beside the bed, where he had been sitting for most of those 3 days. He leaned forward the moment the general stirred. The general's lips moved. His voice was dry, cracked, like paper tearing. But his mind was sharp as a blade. Did Monroe make it in time? Bennett nodded. She saved your life, sir. General Carter closed his eyes. A long, slow exhale escaped his chest, The kind of breath a man releases when the one thing he was holding on to before the darkness took him turns out to be true. I knew she would. He asked to see her that afternoon. Rachel came to his room the way she came to everything now, guarded, arms crossed, eyes careful. She stood at the foot of his bed like a soldier reporting for duty. She wasn't sure she'd been assigned. General Carter studied her face. The monitors beeped softly beside him. Tubes ran from his arms. An oxygen line sat beneath his nose. He looked like a man who had barely survived, because he had. But his eyes were warm, clear. The eyes of a man who had commanded thousands and still remembered every single one. You look tired, Monroe. Rachel almost smiled. Almost. You almost died, sir. I think I'm allowed. Fair point. He adjusted himself slightly against the pillow, wincing. Then he looked at her with an expression she hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not authority. Something closer to regret. There's something you need to know, he said. Something I should have told you 6 years ago. Rachel unfolded her arms. Slowly, the general continued. After Kabusa, I personally filed a commendation recommendation for you. The highest honor available for a combat medic. I wrote it myself, every word. Described what you did out there. 9 hours, 12 men, no supplies, no backup. He paused. By the time the paperwork was processed, you had already resigned. Rachel stared at him. She hadn't known. In 6 years, no one had ever told her. I've carried your file since then, the general said. Not out of obligation. Not because the military required it. I carried it because in 40 years of service, you were the finest I ever saw in the field. And Monroe, I have watched a lot of people work. Rachel's throat tightened. She looked away. At the wall. At the monitor. At anything that wasn't the face of a man telling her she mattered in a way no one else had ever bothered to say. The general wasn't finished. When I was going under, when the doctors told me they were losing the fight and it was time to prepare, I gave one order. Get Rachel Monroe. He held her gaze. But I need you to understand something. I gave the order. That was my decision. The young man out there, Cole. Rachel's breath caught. He didn't wait for the order. The moment your name was mentioned, he volunteered. Didn't ask permission. Didn't wait for authorization. Broke protocol to make sure he was the one who came to find you. The general's voice softened, the way only a man who has seen decades of war and sacrifice can soften. That boy didn't come for the mission, Monroe. He came for you. Rachel sat very still. The monitors beeped. The oxygen hissed. The room held its breath. She thanked the general quietly, squeezed his hand once, and left. The hallway stretched out in front of her, long, white, empty. She walked it slowly, not with purpose, with weight. Every step carried the last 6 years on its back. She replayed the argument, every word. But this time, she heard them differently. Ethan's voice, not controlling, desperate. Not a man trying to run her life, but a man terrified of watching her be destroyed by the same silence that had taken her away from him 6 years ago. He hadn't gone behind her back because he thought she was weak. He'd done it because he'd already lost her once to silence, and he couldn't survive losing her to injustice too. She found herself in the east corridor. The same hallway. The same stretch of wall where they had sat together after the surgery, shoulder to shoulder on the cold floor, while the world finally went quiet enough to hear each other breathe. She sat down. Same spot. Back against the wall. Knees up. The floor was still cold. The silence was still full. But this time, the space beside her was empty. And the emptiness was louder than anything she'd ever heard. She sat there for a long time, thinking about every wall she'd ever built, every door she'd closed, every person she'd walked away from before they could walk away from her. She had told herself it was strength. She had told herself that needing no one meant no one could hurt her. But sitting on that floor, in the exact spot where Ethan Cole had sat beside her without saying a word and let the silence hold them both, she realized something she had been running from for 6 years. Being alone isn't the same as being strong. Sometimes it's just being alone. Ethan was packing. A reassignment had come through that morning. Standard rotation. He was expected at base by 2200 hours. He folded his uniforms with mechanical precision. The kind of muscle memory that doesn't require thought, which was good, because his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He sat at the small desk in his temporary quarters. A single lamp, a notepad, a pen. He stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he started writing. He wrote about Kabusa, about lying in the dirt with shrapnel in his side and hearing her voice cut through the chaos like the only sound left in the world, about gripping her wrist and meaning it when he said he wasn't going anywhere, about watching the helicopter take her away and realizing, too late, that he'd never told her what those 9 hours had meant. He wrote about the 6 years after, the silence, the phone he picked up 100 times and never dialed, the way her voice still lived in his head, calm, steady, telling him to stay, and how it was the only thing that got him through some nights. He wrote about the lobby, seeing her standing there with that cardboard box and feeling something in his chest collapse like a building that had been standing on nothing. He wrote about the hallway, sitting beside her, the silence that said everything. He wrote about the argument, the things he said that he'd cut out of his own chest if he could, the look on her face when he'd said the wrong thing in the worst possible way. He didn't ask her to forgive him. He didn't ask for anything. He just told her the truth. All of it, every piece he'd been carrying, laid flat on the page like a man emptying his pockets before a long walk. He folded the letter, wrote her name on the front, walked it to the nurse's station, and set it down. Make sure she gets this. Then he walked toward the exit. Rachel found the letter an hour later. A nurse flagged her down. Someone left this for you. She saw her name in his handwriting, and her hands went still. She opened it standing right there at the station. She read the first line, and her breath caught. She read the second line, and her jaw tightened. By the third paragraph, her hands were trembling, not the way they'd trembled after the surgery, from adrenaline and exhaustion. This was different. This was the tremble of something frozen beginning to thaw. She read every word. Then she read it again. She folded the letter carefully, along the exact same creases he had made, and pressed it against her chest. She closed her eyes, held it there, against her heartbeat. And in that moment, standing in a military hospital hallway with a handwritten letter pressed against her chest and 6 years of walls crumbling around her like paper in the rain, Rachel Monroe made a choice. Not the safe choice, not the strong choice, not the Rachel Monroe choice, the human choice. She started walking, fast,